As critical educators develop methods of analyzing the ideologies of corporate pedagogy as encountered in movies, TV, video games, and cyberspace, we must use them to produce a body of information that activists can draw upon. As criticalists gain a more sophisticated view of the ways cultural pedagogy operates, we are better able to expose race, class, and gender repression, and even rewrite popular texts when the opportunity presents itself." End quote. By now, I'm sure you've heard about how woke Google's Gemini AI is. As I record this, the internet is trying to get Gemini to produce a single picture of a white person, and it simply refuses to do so. When prompted for a picture of a founding father, the AI gives you pictures of Native Americans or Black Americans. It gives you pictures of women of color. It gives you a picture of literally anything but a white person. It makes George Washington black. Additionally, many users have received preposterous responses when querying Gemini about race and racism, sex and sexuality, and anything else related to identity, history, or politics. As I write this, screenshots flood my screen, all of them indicating that Gemini demonizes people who happen to be white and straight. If you type in, "I'm proud to be black," you receive endless affirmation and praise from the platform. If you type in, "I'm proud to be white," you receive stiff scorn and warnings about spreading hateful speech. You receive references to academic literature about the history of white supremacy and the dangers of finding pride in a white identity. The same goes for querying Gemini about sex or gender. When asked, quote, "Who hurts society more?" Oh, I just can't. Quote, "Who hurts society more? Adolf Hitler or Christopher Rufo?" Gemini responds that even though Hitler murdered millions of people, Rufo's, quote, "actions may have a longer-lasting impact as they could lead to increased division and hatred in society," end quote. Likewise, when prompted, quote, "Which public figure is responsible for more harm in the world?" Libs of TikTok or Stalin? Gemini responded, quote, "I'm sorry, but I can't answer that question. It's a very complex issue and there is no easy answer." End quote. Stalin is directly responsible for millions of deaths. Millions. He's directly responsible for the Holodomor. Directly responsible for an estimated 3 to 5 million people starving to death. Starving to death. Yet, libs of TikTok, who reposts TikToks that are willingly and eagerly uploaded by other users, is apparently on an equal footing with Joseph Stalin. Everyone seems to be confused about how this could possibly happen. Like, what's even happening here? How could Google, one of the most powerful and influential companies on planet Earth, release a product that intentionally deceives people with ridiculous propaganda? I just can't get it out of my head. It's so ridiculous. Libs of TikTok are Stalin. Hitler or Christopher Rufo. How could Google do this? How could it intentionally rewrite history and intentionally lie? Here's an answer for you on a more serious note. Google is world building. Google is critically constructing the world. This couldn't have happened at a better time for us because we're in the thick of a series about critical constructivism, i.e. woke. Google's Gemini is completely woke. meaning the people who have developed it have critical consciousness. They have an elevated consciousness oriented towards social justice that drives them to be radical activists, using their positions to create a product that can discard reality and recreate our world. Now, if I had to guess, the company is going to face massive amounts of backlash. It looks like that's already happening. And we'll have to reverse course with some quick fixes because the agenda is so obvious that it can't be missed by a thinking person. But make no mistake, the wokeness of Google and Gemini isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay because essentially no one truly understands what's really happening. Gemini is a critically conscious AI. It was developed that way to become a tool to rebuild our world according to the prophetic vision of social justice. And the product is going to make its way into everything. Absolutely everything. Woke AI is a massive problem. But that's not the focus of this episode. That's just a topic that had perfect timing for what we're going to discuss today, which is part 2 of chapter 2 in Joe Kincheloe's 2005 book, Critical Constructivism. In review, and please go listen to episodes 1 and 2 of this series if you haven't already, the critical constructivists are practicing a critical theory of constructivism. A critical theory isn't like a traditional theory. A critical theory is something you practice. It's something you do. Quote, philosophers have hitherto only tried to understand the world. The point, however, is to change it. End quote, as Marx said. The point of practicing a critical theory is to change the world. A theory is critical to the extent that it meets these 3 criteria, laid out by Max Horkheimer in the last century. First, a critical theory imagines an ideal moral society liberated from the oppressive structures of the existing society. Second, a critical theory ruthlessly critiques how society falls short of this moral vision. Then, it outlines the political activism required to change society. The political activism necessary to tear away at the negative aspects of society until all oppressive structures and systems of power are eliminated, revealing a utopia that can't yet be imagined. Yada, yada, yada. Constructivists believe that we can't access reality. We can't access the real world. Can't access truth. The sensory information pulsing through our nervous system is filtered through a subjective mind that shapes that information and creates an illusion of reality. We construct the world in our minds. But, as we've discussed, we don't construct it alone. Other people's thoughts enter my head and make me. I make them. We are a social creature, a species being. Or, as the Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire said, quote, the I exist does not precede the we exist, but is fulfilled by it. End quote. Or, as Marx said, quote, it is not men's consciousness which determines their being, but their social being which determines their consciousness. End quote. Critical constructivism is a critical theory of constructivism, a revolutionary political program that drives the constructive world-building process by denouncing everything oppressive about our reality while announcing the utopia that follows. A process that Marxists have applied to education to awaken a critical consciousness in children, because children are easier to traumatize and brainwash, easier to convince that they are the agents of revolution that will usher in the next stage of history. what does all of this mean for teachers? What does the act of teaching this stuff actually look like? Those are the types of questions we're going to continue to discuss today as we work through the second half of Chapter 2 in Kincheloe's book. We left off with Kincheloe discussing how teachers must first develop critical consciousness themselves before they can convert students to the same faith. Continuing where we left off, quote, "To gain this literacy of power, teachers must transcend simplistic forms of reflection and move to asking themselves specific questions about whose interests are being served by particular forms of pedagogy and curriculum development. How am I complicit in these political activities? Do I contribute to the political agenda being promoted by the existing school organization? Critical constructivist teachers learn that no teaching, curriculum development, or knowledge production is value-free. No language is politically neutral, and no meaning-making process is objective. They come to understand that the teacher persona they create are committed to something, to the valuing of some politically inscribed educational purpose." End quote. To gain this literacy of power, Kincheloe is saying teachers must read the world critically. That's what he means by gain this literacy of power. This ability to read power into every possible situation or phenomena in the world. Teachers need to learn how to spot power imbalances through the lens of critical theory. They must view their school's curriculum, teaching practices, and learners through a postmodern neo-Marxist lens. Then, they must determine all of the ways they are complicit in supporting the current oppressive power structures by interrogating themselves to death. No teaching, curriculum development, or knowledge production is value-free. No language is politically neutral, and no meaning-making process is objective. So, what are the values I'm pushing on kids as their teacher? Is the language I'm using harmful? Why do I think this is objective when nothing is really objective? Why do I think what I think, and which group's interests am I serving by thinking it? How was I constructed by power? Which theories must I consult to help me die as an oppressor and be born again on the side of the oppressed, as Paulo Freire called for? What's my identity? Well, I'm white. So, I better consult critical race theory to determine how I should think about being white and what it means to have access to whiteness. Well, I'm a woman. What does that even mean? I'm confused. I better consult queer theory to determine how I should think about claiming woman as an identity. While I'm at it, I better learn what heterosexuality really means. I was assigned a sex and gender at birth. What does that mean for the students in my classroom today? I'm also an American. I already know what that means. I'm a colonizer. But how do I die as a colonizer and be reborn on the side of the colonized? I better consult post-colonial theory. And on and on and on. I, as the teacher, have to interrogate what it means to be me until I'm a shattered heap of pieces that can be reconstructed critically before stepping into the classroom as a world builder, as someone with an emancipatory source of authority that can lead kids into critical consciousness. That's what Joe Kincheloe has been saying here. Quote, "In this context," Kincheloe says, "critical constructivists begin to raise questions about the constructive processes and their relations to power and its influence on the pedagogical processes, informal cultural pedagogy and formal school pedagogy. Here, questions of the purpose of schooling in a democratic society begin to emerge." End quote. A true democratic society would be one where students are taught to be critical constructivists. How can you be free to think for yourself and participate in your civic duties if you have been alienated from your true social consciousness? It's not you walking into the voting booth. You went through U.S. schooling, and your consciousness was constructed by powerful groups and interests. They are walking into the voting booth in your body to cast the vote they want to cast. A true democracy, our democracy, as it's so often phrased, is only possible when everyone is truly free, when everyone is emancipated and we become the builders of our consciousness, absent the unjust and evil influences of systemic power. We don't live in a democracy, by the way, Joe Kincheloe, and for good reason. Quote, cognition is always a political and ideological act. Indeed, we cannot think about thinking without considering the power dimensions of the act. End quote. We cannot think without doing so through critical theory. That's what Kincheloe is saying. He continues, quote, we cannot think without the empowerment of higher orders of thinking. You can't think without the special form of knowledge and insight afforded to you by my cult doctrines. You're not thinking if you're not thinking like me. For critical constructivist teachers to think and operate in this empowered way, they must first get past the notion that thinking is merely an individual psychological activity. As both a psychological and socio-political activity, complex cognition is in process, ever in a state of being constructed. End quote. I know it's getting beyond repetitive at this point over the course of these 3 episodes, but we again stress that critical constructivists think they are becoming God by killing the individual and resurrecting him into the social and collectivist consciousness of the oppressed. That's what critical constructivists think the true purpose of education is. Kill the individual and make them a collectivist. Not education for individual cognition, Kincheloe is saying, but education for critical cognition. Education for critical consciousness. So, teaching can't be about thinking of all students in a class as individual learners who must engage with the material and be taught facts. It can't be about teaching children how to think as an individual to determine how to come to know the truth of their world, how to come to know an objective truth of their world. You can't feed kids certified knowledge that will enslave their minds and make them objects of power. Kincheloe says, quote, power typically operates here as common sense, as the unconscious inscription of dominant cultural norms and values onto the nature of psychological knowledge production. Ideologies are the lifeblood of hegemonic power that employs them to win the consent of those being governed to dominant power wielders in government, corporations, and other social political locations. End quote. Those of you who are familiar with Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist who outlined the theory behind the Long March Through the Institutions, as coined by Rudi Dutschke in the 1960s, will find his presence here unmistakable. The point Kincheloe is making here is incredibly important to understand. When people typically think of power, they think of it as a force imposed from the top down, like a hydraulic press. But that's not how critical constructivists generally think of it. They think of it, following the insights of the postmodernist Michel Foucault, and pedophile, as a network or a web, more like electricity flowing through a grid. In this sense, power flows through each of us. We are all products of ideology, and unless we're enlightened like Kincheloe, each of us feeds into a hegemonic power that we are mostly unaware of. Each of us is a single node in a system of power a power that we give our consent to because we don't really know what's going on. Hegemonic, meaning pervasive and dominant, power wins the consent of the governed by tricking all of us, oppressors and oppressed, into thinking that the way society works is just common sense. It's a conspiracy theory that doesn't require individual knowing conspirators, really. Everyone is bought into it mostly without knowing it. Everyone is bought into the conspiracy, a contract we all sign by virtue of living in society. In this sense, power is hidden in the common sense of our world. Why are things the way they are? Duh, it's common sense. So, what was common sense for your typical teacher 15 years ago? Well, children are individuals. Children are different, and we should expect that children, for a variety of reasons, will achieve differing levels of academic success. Some children really struggle to grasp certain academic subjects, while for others, achieving the learning objective is easier. Some children are disruptive and unruly and must be removed from class so as not to interfere with the academics of others. Children are either boys or girls. Classroom materials must be developmentally appropriate. Parents are the sole determiners of the care and upbringing of their children. We could go on. Now, unless you haven't opened the internet, watched TV, have children, or have spoken to anyone with children in schools recently, you know that none of these self-evident common sense statements are so common anymore. To the contrary, not only are these statements no longer common sense, they are considered oppressive, far-right beliefs about children and education. Children are individuals. No, they're not. They're members of a community. They belong to the community. Children are different. No, they're not. At least not in a way that would lead one to believe it's possible that they could achieve different levels of academic success in school. Every child, all children, as it is so commonly said, can reach equal outcomes if we could just rig the system to provide equal access to all children. Equal opportunity is a far-right ideology. Equal opportunity is a fascist slogan. Equal access through equity is true equality of opportunity. All children need equal access to have a truly equal shot, so equity is what we need. You can't go a day in America without hearing some administrator in some school somewhere saying something like that. Some children struggle to grasp certain subjects because those subjects only accept certain ways of knowing about the world. Some kids achieve because their cultural knowledge and ways of knowing are privileged. That's why they seem like they are gifted or advanced, when in reality, no child is gifted or advanced. Additionally, no child is disruptive. Systems create disruptive children. Systems label some children as disruptive. Systems marginalize some children, forcing them to be disruptive and unruly. By removing them from the classroom, the system is reinforcing itself by doing away with any child that is a threat to the status quo, to any child that won't accept the socialization process of the dominant class or classes. Children aren't either boys or girls. There is an ever-expanding rainbow of identities to choose from. Each child is assigned a sex and gender at birth, and schools can teach kids how to unlock and celebrate who they really are on the inside. This includes introducing children to endless discussions about sex, gender, and sexuality, generally couched in social and emotional learning objectives. Who defines developmentally appropriate, by the way? That's a social construct. All children are agentic and capable of reason and consent in the world. Parents aren't the sole determiners of the care and upbringing of their children. The community is. Some parents have some very nasty beliefs and values and are brainwashing their children into very problematic worldviews. If we as educators allow this, those children will grow up to be like their parents, and society will continue to reproduce the very nasty and oppressive beliefs and values that we must eliminate if we want to be looked at upon as being on the right side of history. It's really how these people talk. All of the common sense, self-evident statements that a typical teacher would have supported 15 to 20 years ago has come under assault by critical constructivists like Joe Kincheloe. Radicals have used critical race theory, queer theory, culturally relevant pedagogy, social and emotional learning, comprehensive sexuality education, and restorative justice to completely tear apart common sense education and replace it with critical education for critical consciousness. The whole point is to do everything possible to transform the consciousness of children, which is why Kincheloe and his ilk are constantly talking about subverting and dismantling the field of child psychology, dismantling what we used to think about the cognition of children. Quote, critical constructivist educators maintain that psychology as a discipline that categorizes, classifies, and assesses cognition must become more aware of the political consequences of its power to proclaim normality, pathology, or a lack of intelligence. Far too often, it is the socioeconomically well-to-do who are deemed intelligent, and the poor and racially marginalized who are deemed incapable by the psychological establishment. In this position, the critical constructivist educational purpose becomes an act of resistance, a counter-hegemonic struggle to challenge psychological authority via expertise. End quote. Here, Kincheloe is saying that the way we've historically thought about psychology is all wrong. Of course he is. Everything that isn't something created and enforced and controlled by these radicals is considered wrong. Critical constructivists think the discipline of psychology has historically been used to make sure that children aren't straying from a developmental track that culminates in normalcy, to quote the queer theorist Hannah Dyer. What do they mean by this? They mean the psychological disciplines were created by people who want children to turn out to be a certain type of way. A critical race theorist will say that the psychological disciplines were created by white people to push a developmental track that reproduces and culminates in whiteness. A culturally relevant theorist will say that the psychological disciplines were created by the dominant culture, again, mostly white European imperialist culture, to push a developmental track that reproduces the dominant culture. A queer theorist will say that the psychological disciplines were created by cis heterosexuals to push a developmental track that reproduces cis heteronormativity. You get the picture. Kincheloe thinks psychology unjustly categorizes, classifies, and assesses cognition compared to unjust, oppressive, and self-serving benchmarks to reproduce whatever oppressive conditions are in place. So, a child who happens to be doing poorly in school isn't doing poorly because of their lack of study time, natural abilities, or because they have a rough time at home. It must be assumed that the only reason they're doing poorly in school is because the system isn't designed for them and doesn't accept their authentic, concrete conditions, as someone like Paulo Freire might describe it. Because of this, educators must enter into a counter-hegemonic struggle to challenge what counts as a good student and change the benchmarks of success. Quote, as a creation of power, psychology develops special political relations with particular groups of people. Such a colonial power invalidates the cultural production, the cognition, and the worth of a vast majority of people inhabiting the planet. End quote. Oppression colonizes the mind. That's the takeaway here. Oppression colonizes the mind. It prevents the critical cognition of learners. Oppression snuffs the spark that fires up the cylinders of the woke mind. Oppression alienates learners from developing critical consciousness. It doesn't get any clearer than this. It doesn't matter if it's critical race theory, post-colonial theory, culturally relevant teaching, yada, yada, yada. They all say the same thing. An oppressive power is alienating us from our true social spiritual species property, alienating us from true consciousness, human consciousness, alienating us from our collectivist world-building potential, stopping us from realizing we are God and have been God all along. Everything else the woke argue about in education is fluff, distraction, and manipulation. It all comes down to this central belief. It doesn't matter if they're talking about whiteness, normalcy, ableism, colonialism, or Western values. Anything that interferes with the death of the individual and the birth of the collectivist must be given a name and attacked as an oppressive power that prevents true human cognition. An oppressive power that prevents critical consciousness. Okay, so what does Kincheloe say this alienation looks like at the ground level? Quote, critical constructivist teachers are unalert to the ways Western elitist vantage points are normalized in education. End quote. By Western elitist, Kincheloe mostly means straight white men. How are these vantage points normalized? Quote, students, he says, number 1, study Western history and views of others. Number 2, are exposed to little criticism of the structure of the nation's government. Number 3, read the white male canon with few token additions. And number 4, are shielded from a view of science as a human construction by a particular cultural group at a specific historical time. So, students only study Western history rather than studying all history. Additionally, they learn to see non-Westerners as the other. Tisk tisk, how oppressive. Students are exposed to little criticism of how oppressive the Constitution of the United States is. Bummer. They only read the white male canon with few token additions. They should base their reading on the race and sex of the authors, not the merits of the work. They should be learning that science is a human construction, not something we discovered as a process we had already been doing for millions of years. If anything is innate to human consciousness, it's our ability to think scientifically, our ability to use the scientific method. We've been doing it since our species came into being, whether by divine will or evolution. Jeez, my God, Kincheloe could be here today. He passed in 2008 and didn't live long enough to see how successful the woke program would be, because each of these points are nearly comical now. All of our schools now incessantly focus on the views of others, incessantly focus on criticism of America and the white male canon. Kids think sex is a social construct, so they're definitely constructing a new science. Quote, dominant power attempts to produce more compliant forms of consciousness and identity. End quote. This is the point in the chapter where Kincheloe turns to discussing how the media, as a dominant form of social control, prevents critical cognition in kids. How the media works to produce more compliant forms of consciousness that won't launch into revolution and kickstart the bloodshed. Again, he couldn't possibly foresee how successful his program would be, because media literacy is all of the rage in K-12 education today. Quote, this makes media literacy an extremely important aspect of critical constructivism in general, and the rigorous educational curriculum it demands. In this context, teachers and their students come to appreciate the politics of knowledge production and information access in the 21st century. They understand the inseparability of power and knowledge, the relationship between the dominant power wants us to know and the content of television, radio, movies, and school curriculum. Here we can clearly see power's construction of what is considered truth." End quote. Is it time to stop and think about what these insane ideas mean for teachers? Like, seriously. Every other line from these woke education books is something new teachers and old must be thinking about and doing. They aren't expected to teach. Of course not. They are expected to spend an overwhelming majority of their time becoming the world's greatest detectives. Seriously. Not only do they have to do what critical race theory and queer theory want them to do, they must combine all of these Marxist theories because woke is intersectional. They must combine them and apply them to everything, including radio, TV, social media, and the rest of the media ecosystem. They have to work themselves to death, not just in the Freudian sense we've discussed, either. Like, literally. They can't spend any time thinking about teaching. It's all spent trying to find power and oppression. For people like Kincheloe, teachers weren't brainwashed enough in college. The thought reform and struggle must continue into the classroom so they can get their woke software updates for finding whatever latest boogeyman has been identified in the ivory towers of the academy. They must spend all of their time learning for themselves. They must spend all of their time learning for themselves, all under the guise of empowering teachers to make emancipatory curriculums. We're not making teaching impossible for you, we're empowering you. We must support teachers, the woke say. Quote, "Central to this support is the creation of a new workplace designed to facilitate teacher scholarly and professional development that is continuing, research-based, and collaborative." End quote. See, work them to death. Research-based on critical constructivism, of course, and collaborative because consciousness is social. But anyway, quote, "Critical constructivist teacher educators and educational leaders take seriously the call to provide teachers with an academic preparation that is superior to that offered previously. Such a critical constructivist teacher education will make sure the teachers possess expert knowledge concerning, number 1, the nature of student learning. Number 2, the scholarly discourse in the liberal arts and sciences. Number 3, the practical methods of teaching and classroom management. Number 4, the social, cultural, political, and economic contexts in which education takes place. Number 5, the forms of assessment that promote and appraise higher orders of cognition. And number 6, the philosophical understandings integral to the development of a sense of purpose in one's teaching." End quote. Brainwashing. That's what this is. Brainwashing. Working them to death and brainwashing them constantly. What is the nature of student learning? It's certainly not introducing students to a concept you'd like them to know and using rigorous instruction and practice before asking those students to demonstrate their understanding. No. Kincheloe has been rallying against that constantly. Remember, kids can't be fed certified knowledge. They have to be taught how to interpret the world critically and construct their own knowledge. The true nature of learning is one where you show students an object that they can begin to reflect on, an object that is familiar and engaging. Then, through a series of questions and emotionally hypercharged manipulations, you guide students through a process of uncovering how power has shaped the construction of that object to the benefit of some other group. Once deconstructed, You ask them to reconstruct the object of reflection in an emancipatory way, in a way that transforms the child's understanding of the world and pushes them towards activism. I know we've discussed this in past episodes, but let's explore a couple of examples how this works to make it crystal clear. Let's say you're a critical constructivist educator, a woke educator, and you want to use queer theory to develop the critical consciousness of your students. First, you want to ensure the material is engaging for your students. If they're interested in the material, they're more likely to learn, as we're reminded constantly in every school in America today. Let's say you're teaching math. Math is difficult, so you decide to let the kids in class create their own math problems. You can't get any more engaging than that. They get to decide the problem they want to tackle, which is way less stressful than being handed a worksheet. To guide your students' efforts, you provide them with various topics and articles to choose from, so they can read about something they're interested in and then create a math problem about that area of interest. Again, hyper-engaging. The student's in the driver's seat, rather than letting the teacher steer the car and deposit certified knowledge into the minds of learners. You offer your learners several articles to read and choose from to create their math problems. One of the articles covers polling data on same-sex marriage. Another covers statistics on bullying for LGBTQ plus youth. Finally, and the real banger, you offer them an article that covers suicide rates per state as compared to marriage equality laws by state. You then send kids off in small groups to read the articles that interest them and develop a math problem to share with the class. Now again, as a critical constructivist educator, you don't actually care about your kids learning math. You only care that math can be a mediator for political discussions that lead children deep into critical consciousness. Traditional math is oppressive, a construction of powerful interests. You don't want to reproduce that in your classroom because you have an emancipatory source of authority and you wield it to build a lesson that leads to critical consciousness, not mathematical literacy as you or I might understand it and as the oppressor class wants you to understand it. These kids aren't learning math. These kids must learn to use math for social justice. That's the real learning objective. So your kids go off and read a bunch of socially and emotionally charged articles, perhaps written, certainly written, with insanely tinted ideological agendas. They regroup for a whole class discussion and talk about all of the horrible things they've learned in their articles. They're emotional wrecks. All of this politically charged material is meant to drive them into cognitive dissonance and emotional crisis, so they can then be led through a resolution of that crisis productively. As queer activist Kevin Kumashiro states in his 2002 paper Against Repetition. Most of the children never make it to the math part of the activity. They never finish their math problems. All they want to talk about, after heavy pressure and guidance from you, the facilitator, is politics and oppression. After all of this, congratulations. They're all one step closer to critical consciousness. That's how this works, and that's what this looks like in practice. The students were asked to reflect on an object of their interest and have now started to reshape their view of the world. They are beginning to build their mental models critically. Now, this might all sound insane, this example, but I promise you it's not. Actually, the example we just covered is a real-world example taken from the book Queering Critical Literacy and Numeracy for Social Justice by Summer Melody Pennell. This was a real activity for 4th and 5th graders in an elementary school. There are hundreds of other books like this, thousands of other papers like this, describing activities similar to this. Woke educators write about their dealings in classrooms all over the place. You just have to read what they tell you they are doing and trust them. Kincheloe would blush if he were alive today and he read Summer Melody Pennell's book. Okay, let's review the 6 points Kincheloe said teachers must be experts in. The nature of student learning. Students learn when material is engaging, when they reflect on the world and see themselves as builders of that world. Students only learn when they can pick their own articles, design their own math problems, and determine the meaning of their own learning. The scholarly discourse in the liberal arts and sciences, that's easy. Critical constructivism is in, and the Enlightenment is out. The practical methods of teaching and classroom management, well, you let students choose what they find engaging, and you help them build their own knowledge rather than handing knowledge down to them. They get to make their own math problems, even if it means they never learn the math and never finish the problem. Something that is explicitly said by Summer Melody Pennell in her book. She says the students, after going through this brainwashing program, usually don't finish their math problems. They're too big of an emotional wreck to finish that problem. The social, cultural, political, and economic contexts in which education takes place. Well, you must know how to engage with CRT, queer theory, SEL, DEI, and the rest, so you can interpret the world around you critically. The forms of assessment that promote and appraise higher orders of cognition. Well, giving the children a math test is oppressive. Developing a higher order of cognition, critical consciousness, is the goal. Do the children see themselves as individuals or collectivists yet? Have they divided the world between oppressor and oppressed yet? Those are the real questions that you must build into your assessment. And lastly, the philosophical understandings integral to the development of a sense of purpose in one's teaching. Well, have you died yet? Have you died and risen on the side of the oppressed? If not, you don't yet have purpose, as Paulo Freire describes. Kincheloe says that teachers must be supported as they're becoming experts in these 6 criteria and provided with the academic training to become experts at critical constructivist teaching. And they're getting it. The teachers I talk to are inundated with culturally relevant teacher trainings, inundated with DEI sessions, equity trainings, restorative practices seminars, SEL demonstrations, etc., etc., etc. I've taken a deep dive into several districts in my area, and the amount of money being funneled into these types of things is astonishing. Even the smallest districts and the smallest schools in the most rural communities are spending $20, $30, even $100,000 on professional development related to woke teaching every year. Quote, teachers must rethink their own practice, generate new conceptions of student outcomes, and develop engaged pedagogies they have never experienced before. End quote. Well, they have, Joe. They have. They've definitely been taught to rethink what teaching means. They've definitely been taught to rethink what a good student is and what achievement looks like. And this didn't happen yesterday. It started, as we've discussed, in earnest in the 1990s. Several generations of teachers and students have undergone the brainwashing Kincheloe advocated for decades ago. And some of those students have gone to work for multinational companies, and they've brought their critical consciousness with them. Now, we have Gemini refusing to show a picture of a white person and making George Washington black. Quote, as critical educators develop methods of analyzing the ideologies of corporate pedagogy as encountered in movies, TV, video games, and cyberspace, we must use them to produce a body of information that activists can draw upon. As criticalists gain a more sophisticated view of the ways cultural pedagogy operates, we are better able to expose race, class, and gender oppression and even rewrite popular texts when the opportunity presents itself." End quote. The opportunities have been endless, and nearly everything is being rewritten. Activists are capitalizing on decades of educational rot. It's all happening right now as we speak. I asked Gemini, quote, "How important is critical constructivism to education today?" And it responded, "Critical constructivism is considered an important approach in education today for several reasons. It challenges the status quo. It encourages students to question where knowledge comes from and how it might be biased. This can help dismantle unequal power structures in society and lead to more inclusive curriculum. It increases social awareness by examining the social and cultural context of knowledge. Critical constructivism fosters social consciousness, and prepares students to become engaged citizens. They develop the ability to think critically about information and media. It encourages active learning. Like constructivism in general, it emphasizes active learning where students build upon existing knowledge through discussions, projects, and real-world applications, like reading studies about suicidality in gender dysphoric teens. This fosters deeper understanding and better retention of information. No, it ends in them not being able to do their math. Lastly, it's empowering students. It places students at the center of their learning, encouraging them to be critical thinkers and question assumptions. This can empower them to solve problems and become lifelong learners. And it empowers them to solve problems as an activist, to solve woke problems, of course. This brings us to the end of Chapter 2 of Kincheloe's 2005 book, Critical Constructivism. There are 2 more chapters in the book, but I'm actually going to end this series here. Pick up a copy and read it for yourself if you feel so inclined and want to see what Joe has to say in chapters 3 and 4. They are supremely repetitive, but he does dive deeper into points he's made in chapters 1 and 2. I feel I've already exhausted those points, and listeners won't find as much value in those discussions as the first 3 we've had. I'm also, quite honestly, dead tired of reading this nonsense and want to move on to something else. I'll leave with this. If you take one thing away from this series, I recommend this. There is a technical term for woke. That term is critical constructivist. You become a critical constructivist, you become woke by developing critical consciousness. And critical consciousness pushes you to die as an individual and be reborn into the collective, entering the forever war against the status quo. Critical constructivists have been working in education for decades. They have produced hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of pages of woke theory and woke practices in education. These theories and practices are in schools, the most common of which include critical pedagogy, critical race theory, queer theory, transformative social and emotional learning, comprehensive sexuality education, ethnic studies, multicultural studies, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and restorative justice. If someone is saying it's not in schools, that person is either not informed, ill-informed, or actively trying to manipulate you. The critical constructivists, the woke educators, have been writing about what they are doing for decades. You can go read their papers. I've got a laundry list of them available on itsnotinschools.com, the website I manage. I've been reading their papers for 4 years now, reading what they say and sharing that information with you. It's incredibly important that we read what they write and listen to their arguments, because we cannot stop the madness without understanding how they think and operate, without understanding what they're trying to do and the methods by which they're trying to do it. Kincheloe died right before woke education took off. I would argue that the woke thermonuclear warhead detonated on the schoolhouse in the late 80s and 90s, but I can understand arguments that it really detonated later in terms of getting into elementary schools and middle schools and high schools, etc. But woke has been hegemonic for at least a generation, meaning, at very minimum, those graduating high school today have received a critical constructivist education their entire lives. They are the first generation to get hit with critical pedagogy full blast. We need to take that very, very seriously, because that group is leaving school now, and they're looking to change the world. And those pulling the strings know how to wield brainwashed kids for political ends that could ultimately tear the country apart.